that woman?
He never thought she would come here.
My son, I came for your wedding.
Don't call me that. I don't have a mother like you!
In a room full of beauty and power, she stood alone.
Stop this wedding.
Do you even know who you just humiliated?
But what happened that day didn't begin at the wedding. It started years earlier, where no one there had ever been. The village sat quietly beneath a wide, open sky, where the horizon stretched endlessly and the earth was stained a deep, familiar red. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly, but hardship never did. In that small Nigerian village, far from the noise of the city and the promises it carried, a boy grew up learning about life in ways no child ever should. His father had died when he was still too young to understand what death truly meant. There were no long conversations about it. No detailed stories of the man who had once been there. Just a quiet absence. And the way his mother never spoke his name without a pause that lingered just a little too long. What remained was simple. A small home, a mother, and a child who would come to understand that love sometimes looks like sacrifice, long before it looks like comfort. She was a woman shaped by survival. Her skin, dark and worn by years beneath the Nigerian sun, carried the story of every day she had fought to keep going. Her hands were rough, not from age, but from work endless, unforgiving work that never seemed to promise enough in return. Every morning, before the village had fully woken, she would rise. The air would still be cool, touched by the softness of dawn, but there was no hesitation in her movements. She would tie her wrapper carefully around her waist, adjust her worn headscarf, and step outside into a world that expected everything from her, and gave very little back. Her son would watch her sometimes, from the doorway, from the corner of the small room they shared, from that quiet place where children begin to notice more than they are meant to. At first, he didn't understand why she moved the way she did, why she never seemed to rest, why her breathing was sometimes heavy, even before the day had begun. But slowly, that confusion turned into something else. Awareness. She worked the land with a kind of silent determination that could not be taught. Bent over the soil, her fingers pressed into the earth as though willing it to give just a little more. The sun would rise higher, hotter, more relentless, and still she remained there, moving, digging, lifting, enduring. And when the fields gave what little they could, she would gather it all. Cassava, vegetables, anything of value. She would place them into a worn basket and carry them to the roadside market, where she sat among others, just like her women, who understood that survival was not about ease, but about persistence. Her son saw all of it, not all at once, but piece by piece, moment by moment, until the picture became impossible to ignore. He saw the way she wiped sweat from her face with the back of her hand, never stopping long enough to rest. He saw how her shoulders lowered slightly when she thought no one was looking, as though the weight of everything she carried had finally found a moment to settle. And he saw something else too, something quieter, something harder to explain. He saw what she gave up. There were nights when the small pot of food between them barely seemed enough. The portions were never large, never generous, but somehow, they were always enough for him. She would sit across from him, watching as he ate, her expression calm, almost peaceful. "Eat," she would say softly, and he would. At first without question, but children grow, and with growth comes understanding. He began to notice how she never took a second portion, how her hands rested still in her lap, how her eyes followed each movement of his spoon, not with hunger, but with something deeper, love. And when he finally asked quietly, uncertainly, if she had eaten, she smiled. "I'm not hungry," she said. But the truth lived in the silence that followed. It lived in the way her voice softened just a little too much, in the way she looked away too quickly, in the way her body, despite her words, carried the unmistakable weight of exhaustion. Even as a boy, he understood. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel something shift inside him, enough to realize that the world they lived in was not fair. But she was trying to make it better anyway. For him, he tried, in his own small ways, to carry that understanding. He stayed close to her. He listened when she spoke. He didn't complain, not about the food, not about the heat, not about the long days that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. And sometimes when she returned from the fields, he would run to her, not with excitement, but with purpose. He would take the basket from her hands, even when it was too heavy, even when his arms trembled under the weight. He would walk beside her in silence, matching her steps, as though somehow. That made things lighter. Those walks home became something more than routine. They became a language, a quiet exchange of understanding between a mother who gave everything, and a son who was beginning to see the cost of it. The son, in that part of the world, did not forgive. By midday, it burned with an intensity that seemed almost personal, pressing down on the earth, on the fields, on anyone who dared to stand beneath it for too long. And yet, she stood, day after day, her wrapper clinging to her skin, her movements slower but never stopping, her breath heavier but never breaking. There was no applause for what she did, no recognition, no reward, only the quiet knowledge that somewhere, behind her, watching, learning, was the reason she could not stop. And though others might have seen just another woman working under the sun, her son saw something else. He saw strength that did not need to be spoken. He saw love that did not need to be explained. And even then, before life would take him far from that place, he saw the truth that would follow him forever. That everything he would one day become was built on what she was giving up under that unforgiving Nigerian sun. She wasn't just working. She was giving her life one day at a time. Everything he became started with her sacrifice. He had grown up believing that effort meant something. He believed it when he studied by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, his books spread across a rough wooden table that had already seen too many hard years. He believed it when he woke before sunrise to review old notes while the village still slept. He believed it when he ignored hunger, ignored heat, ignored exhaustion, because somewhere deep inside him there was a simple hope he never dared to say too loudly, that one day all of this would mean something. That one day his mother would not have to bend her back beneath the sun anymore. For years, that hope kept him moving. It carried him through long school days and longer evenings. It followed him into every classroom, every exam, every whispered prayer before sleep. In a village where dreams often faded before they fully formed, education felt like the one narrow bridge between struggle and possibility. And he held onto that bridge with everything he had. So when the exam results finally came, he did not approach them carelessly. He approached them with fear, with hope, with the kind of fragile courage that only comes when someone has already built their future in their mind and is now terrified of seeing it disappear. There were other students around him, some trying to look calm, others already smiling too early, as if confidence alone might rewrite what had been decided. The air felt hot, heavy, restless. His heart pounded hard enough to make everything else sound distant. Then his eyes found his name, and just like that, the world around him changed. He had not passed. For a long moment, he simply stared. Not because he didn't understand what he was seeing, but because he did. Too clearly. The letters blurred anyway. Not from confusion, but from the sudden weight of all the things that result seemed to carry with it. Every early morning, every page memorized by weak light, every sacrifice his mother had made without complaint, every promise he had made silently to himself, it all seemed to collapse into one unbearable truth. It had not been enough. The walk home felt longer than it ever had before. The road was the same. The red earth was the same. The trees swayed in the same dry wind they always had. But nothing felt familiar anymore. The world had not changed, and somehow that made it worse. He wanted the sky to darken. He wanted something to break open. He wanted the ground beneath his feet to acknowledge what had just happened. But the village went on exactly as it always did. Children laughed in the distance. Women carried water. Men spoke beneath the shade of trees. Life, indifferent and steady, continued around him while something inside him quietly gave way. By the time he reached home, his shoulders had already started to carry the shape of defeat. His mother was outside when she saw him. She had been sorting vegetables into small piles to sell the next morning, her fingers moving with the tired precision of someone who could not afford wasted effort. The moment she looked up, something in her face changed. Not panic, not alarm. Just the stillness of a mother who knows before a word is spoken that something is wrong. He tried not to look at her. That more than anything told her the truth. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her wrapper, and waited for him to come closer. He stopped only a few feet away, but even there he seemed far from her, as though shame itself had placed a distance between them. What happened? She asked softly. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. Then, finally, in a voice stripped of all strength, he said it. I failed. The words seemed to fall between them and settle into the dirt. He expected disappointment. He expected silence, maybe even the kind that hurts more than anger. What he did not expect was the gentleness in her eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, not as someone who had failed her, but as someone who was hurting. And somehow that made it even harder for him to stand there. I tried, he said, his voice tighter now. I really tried. I know, she replied. He shook his head, as if her kindness only made the wound sharper. No, Mama, you don't understand. I was supposed to pass. I was supposed to make this worth something. His breathing turned uneven. You worked too hard. You gave up too much. And now... He looked away. Now I have nothing. There it was. Not just failure, but humiliation, the deeper pain beneath it. He was not only disappointed in himself. He was ashamed that after everything his mother had poured into him, he had nothing to place back into her hands. She took a step closer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment everything around them seemed to quiet, as if even the world understood this was one of those turning points that would shape a life. You are not nothing, she said. But he barely heard her. His thoughts had already fallen into a darker place, the place where disappointment begins to rewrite identity. That evening he hardly touched his food. The same small room that had once held his ambitions now felt too small to contain his disappointment. He sat in silence, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if answers might appear there if he looked long enough. Outside, the village softened into night. Crickets filled the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played faint music. Life went on, but inside him there was only stillness. His mother sat nearby, watching him without pressing him. She knew grief had its own rhythm, and this too was grief. Not for a death, but for the future he thought he had already begun to build. After a long time, he spoke again. Maybe this is all I am, he said quietly. Maybe some people are just meant to stay where they were born. His mother's face tightened at that, not with anger, but with sadness, because she had heard those words before. Not from him, from life itself, from every closed door poverty had placed in front of her, from every moment the world had tried to teach her that struggle was permanent and dreaming was foolish. She had spent too many years refusing to believe it. She would not let her son start now. No, she said, more firmly this time. Don't say that. He looked up, exhausted and unconvinced. She leaned slightly toward him, her voice calm but steady, the way it always became when she was speaking from the deepest part of herself. You don't need a degree to succeed. The words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, but strong enough to change the direction of a life. He stared at her, not because the sentence was difficult to understand, but because it was not the answer he had expected. The world around him had taught him that this failure meant the end of something. She was telling him it might only be the end of one path. "There is more than one road," she continued. "School is good. Education is good. But it is not the only way forward." She placed a hand over her chest, then gently pointed toward him. "A good heart. Hard work, discipline. These things matter too." He wanted to believe her. But belief comes slowly when disappointment is fresh. Still, there was something in her voice that night that reached him, not as comfort, but as truth. She was not pretending the pain wasn't real. She was not telling him to forget it. She was simply refusing to let it define him. And because she refused, a small part of him began to refuse too. The next days were quiet. He moved through them with the dull heaviness of someone trying to rebuild himself from the inside out. The shame did not disappear. The disappointment did not vanish. But the sharpness of it began to soften into thought. If not this road, then what? That question followed him everywhere, into the fields, onto the village paths, through the long silences of morning and the even longer silences of night. He watched the world more carefully now. He saw how small the village truly was, how little opportunity it offered beyond survival, how easily a person could spend an entire life working hard and still never move beyond the edge of necessity. And slowly, another thought began to form. It frightened him at first, because it meant distance, because it meant leaving, because it meant stepping into a world larger and harder than anything he had known. But once the thought came, it would not leave him. The city. He had heard of it all his life in fragments, through travelers, through rumors, through stories told at roadside stalls and village gatherings. A place of noise and pressure, a place where men got lost and remade themselves. A place that could break you quickly or change everything. He began to think about it not as fantasy, but as possibility. One evening, as the sky dimmed into deep gold and the last heat of the day still clung to the ground, he sat beside his mother outside their home. She was sorting produce again, her hands moving automatically, practiced and tired. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said it. "I want to go to the city." Her hands stopped, not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough to show that she understood the weight of what he had said. He kept going before fear could silence him. "There's nothing for me here, Mama. Not if I want to become more than this." He swallowed. "I don't know what I'll find there. I don't know how hard it will be. But if I stay here now, I'll never know what I could have been." She looked at him for a long time. In her eyes was everything a mother feels when love and fear must sit side by side. She feared the city. She feared hunger, failure, bad company, loneliness. She feared what the world could do to a young man carrying more hope than protection. But she also knew something else. A child cannot become a man by staying forever in the shadow of his mother's sacrifice. Sometimes love must let go, even when it trembles. And there, under the fading Nigerian sky, with the red earth still warm beneath them and the future standing just beyond what either of them could see, he made the decision that would change everything. He would leave the village. He would go to the city. He left with nothing, except her belief. He started as a driver, not by choice, but by necessity. The city did not welcome him with open arms. It did not care where he came from or what he had left behind. Lagos moved fast, loud, and unforgiving, swallowing men whole if they could not keep up. And on his first days there, he felt small in a way he had never felt in the village. Buildings stretched higher than anything the young Nigerian man with dark skin had ever seen in Lagos, Nigeria. Traffic roared like a living thing. Faces passed him without recognition, without pause, without interest. In the rural Nigerian village, people knew your name. In the city, you had to earn the right to be seen. So he took what he could get. A job as a driver. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he had once imagined for himself when he studied by that dim kerosene light in his village. But it was something. And in a place like Lagos, Nigeria, Something was often the difference between surviving and disappearing. The first time he stood beside the black sedan he would be assigned to, he didn't see a car. He saw an opportunity. The man he worked for was not just any employer. He was a Nigerian businessman, wealthy, respected, and surrounded by a world that felt far removed from everything the young Nigerian man had known before. His office stood behind glass walls and polished floors. His meetings were filled with words that carried weight: contracts, investments, expansion. It was a different universe, and the young Nigerian driver stood at the edge of it, watching, learning, listening. He arrived early, always, before the sun fully rose over Lagos, before the office lights flickered on, before anyone expected him to be there. He cleaned the car himself, wiping every surface until it reflected more than just light. He checked the engine, the tires, the smallest details others might overlook. Because he had learned something important long before he came to the city from his rural Nigerian village. When you have nothing, effort becomes your currency, and he spent it generously. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The job did not change, but he did. He learned the rhythm of Lagos, the shortcuts through crowded streets, the timing of traffic, the subtle differences between impatience and urgency in the tone of his employer's voice. He learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to anticipate a need before it was voiced. He became reliable. And in a world where reliability is rare, that mattered. His employer began to notice. At first, it was small things. A nod of acknowledgement. A brief good job. A longer glance than usual when the car arrived exactly on time despite impossible Lagos traffic. Then, gradually, trust. "Take me to the meeting," his employer would say, handing him an address without explanation. And he would, without questions, without hesitation. There is a certain quiet respect that builds between men who understand discipline. It is not loud. It is not spoken often. But it is there. And slowly, without announcement, the Nigerian driver was no longer just a driver. He was someone his employer could depend on. Someone who would not fail him. And in that trust, his world began to change. He was allowed closer, closer to conversations, closer to decisions, closer to a life he had once only imagined from the outside. He stood near doors that opened into conference rooms filled with powerful voices. He heard fragments of discussions, numbers, strategies, names of companies he had never known existed. He saw how men carried themselves when they had built something from nothing in Nigeria. And without realizing it, he began to carry himself differently too. Not in arrogance, but in quiet confidence. Because for the first time in his life, he could see a path forward that did not end in survival, but in possibility. It was during one of those long days, one that began before sunrise and stretched well into the evening, that everything shifted in a way he did not expect. He had just parked the car outside a private residence in Lagos, one far more elegant than any building he had ever stepped inside. The lights were warm, the garden carefully maintained, the air carrying a sense of calm that did not belong to the chaos of Lagos outside its gates. He waited as he always did, patient, still. Then the front door opened, and she walked out. At first, it wasn't anything dramatic. Not the kind of moment that announces itself loudly. Just a young Nigerian woman stepping into the evening light. But something about her made the world slow. She was young, confident, beautiful in a way that was not loud, but undeniable. Her dark skin glowed softly under the warm lights. Her posture carried ease, her movements natural, unforced. She was dressed simply, but not simply at all. Everything about her suggested a life of comfort, of refinement, of belonging to a world he was still learning how to enter. She didn't look at him immediately. Why would she? To her, he was just the driver. But when she did, there was a brief moment. A glance. And something passed between them that neither of them fully understood. Not recognition, not yet, but awareness. She walked toward the car, her steps measured, her presence quiet but certain. When she reached the door, he stepped forward automatically, opening it for her with the same precision he used for everyone else. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. And he nodded. "Ma, that was all." It should have ended there. It usually did. But life, as he was beginning to understand, rarely follows the paths we expect. She began to appear more often. At first, only occasionally. Then with increasing frequency. Short rides. Longer rides. Conversations that began with small questions about traffic, about Lagos, about nothing at all. And slowly, those conversations became something more. She asked him where he was from. He answered. She asked how long the young black Nigerian man had been in Lagos, Nigeria. He told her. She asked why he came, and for a moment, he hesitated. Because the truth was simple, but it was also heavy. "I wanted a better life," he said. She smiled slightly. "Don't we all?" There was no judgment in the young black Nigerian woman's voice, no distance, no sense that he was speaking from below while she listened from above. And that changed everything. Because for the first time since he had arrived in Lagos, Nigeria, he was not being seen as what he did, but as who he was. That kind of recognition is powerful. It builds quietly, gently, almost unnoticed at first. But once it begins, it grows. Days turned into shared moments. Moments into familiarity. Familiarity into something deeper, something neither of them named, but both of them felt. He found himself looking forward to those drives. Not for the destination, but for the time in between. She, in turn, began to linger. A question asked here, a comment there. A glance that lasted just a second longer than necessary. And somewhere between those seconds, something changed. Lagos still roared around them. The demands of work still pressed against him. The distance between their worlds still existed. But it no longer felt impossible, because hope had returned. Not the fragile hope of a boy studying by dim light in a rural Nigerian village, but the grounded, growing hope of a black Nigerian man beginning to see what he might become. And with that hope came change. Subtle at first, then undeniable. His clothes became sharper. His posture straighter. His voice steadier. He listened more, learned more, observed everything. He no longer stood at the edge of the world he admired. He was stepping into it. And the people around him began to notice. His employer noticed. The staff noticed. And most importantly, her family noticed. Because in a world built on status, on image, on perception, there's always one question that matters more than all others. Where do you come from? It was asked one evening, not casually, but deliberately. They were seated in a room that felt too polished to be comfortable in Lagos, Nigeria. The air carried the quiet tension of evaluation. Her father sat across from him, not unkind, but not warm either. The kind of Nigerian businessman who had built his life carefully and expected others to prove themselves before being allowed into it. "You've done well," the older black Nigerian man said. It was not praise, it was observation. He nodded. "Thank you, sir." A pause followed. Then the question came, simple, direct, unavoidable. "What about your family?" And just like that, everything he had built inside himself shifted. Because in that moment, two worlds collided. The one he came from and the one he was stepping into. He saw it clearly. His mother, her dark hands, her sacrifice. The life she had lived in their Nigerian village so he could stand where he was now. And then he saw this room, the expectations, the standards, the unspoken rules that governed everything around him. He understood something then that he had never fully allowed himself to face. In this world, his truth was not enough. There are moments in a man's life that define him. Not because they are loud, but because they are quiet enough to let him choose. And in that silence, he chose. "My parents," he began. His voice was steady, too steady. And in that steadiness, something inside him closed. "My parents are gone." And that lie would change everything. The family valued reputation above everything else. Not just wealth, Not just success, but the image of it, how it looked, how it was perceived, how it was spoken about in rooms where power quietly shaped the future in Nigeria. In their world, a man was not only measured by what he had built, but by where he came from, who stood behind him, and whether that story aligned with the version of success they believed in. And he was learning that lesson quickly. At first, it came in subtle ways. A pause too long when his background was mentioned. A question asked with a tone that sounded polite, but carried something sharper beneath it. A glance exchanged between relatives when conversations turned toward family, heritage, origins. No one insulted the young black Nigerian man directly. They didn't have to. In circles like theirs, judgment rarely raised its voice. It lived in silence. It lived in the things people chose not to say. He noticed it during dinners. Long tables, fine plates, quiet conversations flowing with ease until something shifted. Someone would ask about his parents, about his Nigerian village, about the people who had raised him. And though his answer had already been given, clean, simple, final, there was always a moment that followed. A moment where the room seemed to weigh him, to measure the distance between who he was and who they expected him to be. "My parents are gone," he had said. And with those words, he had removed something. Not just truth, but complication. It made him easier to accept, easier to place, easier to fit into a world that did not have space for uncertainty. And at first, that felt like relief, because acceptance has a way of quieting doubt. Her family began to open their doors wider. Invitations became more frequent. Conversations became longer. Smiles came easier. He was no longer just the driver who had done well in Lagos. He was someone who could be considered, someone who might belong. But belonging, he was learning, often comes with a price. And that price is rarely spoken out loud. It was during one of those evenings, another gathering filled with laughter that never quite reached him, that the pressure became something he could no longer ignore. Her father stood beside him, holding a glass, watching the room with the calm authority of a Nigerian man who had built his life carefully. "You're doing well," the older man said again. The same words as before, but this time they carried something more. "Thank you, sir." A small nod. Then quietly, "In this world, perception matters." He didn't respond immediately because he understood, even before the rest was said. "You must be careful about what people see," the man continued. "About what they think they know about you." There it was, not a warning. Not exactly, but a reminder, a boundary gently drawn. And in that moment, something inside him tightened, because he realized that the lie he had told was no longer just a sentence spoken once. It had become a foundation, something he now had to maintain, something he now had to protect. Days passed, then weeks, and the pressure did not disappear. It grew, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. He began to notice how often conversations in that world returned to the same themes: legacy, background, family name. How often success was tied not just to what you achieved, but to the story that supported it. He began to understand that in this environment, there was very little space for contradiction, very little space for anything that didn't fit. And slowly, without realizing it at first, he began to adjust. He spoke less about where he came from in Nigeria. He avoided details. He redirected conversations. If someone asked too many questions, he would smile, answer briefly, and move on. And each time he did, the distance between his past and his present grew a little wider. At work, he continued to rise. His employer trusted him more than ever. Responsibilities increased. Access expanded. Doors opened. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. A black Nigerian man building his life, a man moving forward. But inside, something had begun to shift. It started with small things. Moments when his phone would ring, and he would hesitate before answering. He would look at the screen, see the name, and for a second, just a second, feel something pull at him. Then he would silence it, not because he didn't care, But because he didn't know how to carry both worlds at once, he told himself it was temporary, that he just needed time. That once everything was secure, once his position was stronger, once his place in this new life was undeniable, then he would fix it. Then he would return. Then he would explain. But time has a way of turning distance into habit, and habit into silence. The calls became less frequent, then shorter, then, eventually, they stopped. He filled his days with work, with movement, with progress. Because progress is easier to face than reflection. He dressed better, spoke more confidently, moved through rooms with the ease of someone who belonged, and people noticed. They respected him. They welcomed him. They began to speak his name with familiarity. Everything he had once hoped for was happening. And yet, there were moments quiet, unexpected moments when the noise of Lagos faded just enough for something else to be heard, a memory, a voice. His mother's voice, soft, steady, uncomplicated. Those moments never lasted long. He didn't let them, because they brought with them something he wasn't ready to face. Guilt, not loud, not overwhelming, but present. Like a shadow that followed him quietly, waiting for him to stop moving long enough to notice it. And so he kept moving. He told himself that this was what growth looked like. That leaving things behind was part of becoming something new. That sacrifice was necessary. Even if the sacrifice now was not his own. There was a night late when the city finally slowed, the streets quieter, the air heavier, the lights of buildings flickering against the dark sky over Lagos, Nigeria. He sat alone for a moment, his phone in his hand, the screen blank, but his thoughts not. He remembered the village, the red earth, the small home, the black Nigerian woman who had stood under the sun, day after day, giving more than she had. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel it. Not the success, not the progress, but the distance. It had grown. More than he had intended, more than he had planned, more than he wanted to admit. His thumb hovered over the screen. A simple action, a call, that was all it would take. But some actions carry more weight than they appear to, because they don't just reconnect you to a person. They reconnect you to a truth, and truth was something he had been carefully avoiding. The phone remained in his hand. Then slowly, he lowered it. Not today. Not yet. There would be time. He told himself that again. The same way he had told himself before. The same way people often do when they are not ready to face what they have already begun to lose. And with that quiet decision, made not in anger but in avoidance, the distance became something else. Not just space, but separation. He returned to his life. To Lagos. To the version of himself he was building stronger, sharper, more accepted. But somewhere far away, in a Nigerian village that had never stopped being what it was, there was a woman who still woke before sunrise, still worked beneath the same unforgiving sun, still carried the same quiet strength, and still believed, without question, in the son she had raised. Even as he slowly, silently, stopped reaching back, he no longer spoke of her, no longer explained where he came from, no longer allowed that part of his life to exist in the world he now lived in. And eventually, without announcement, without confrontation, without a moment he could point to and say, "This is when it happened," he stopped calling home. The higher he rose, the further he drifted. She came to the city because she had heard her son was getting married. The news did not reach her through him. It came the way many things reach a village, through voices passing along roads, through men returning from the city with stories larger than their own lives, through women at the market repeating what they had heard until rumors settled into something that felt close enough to truth. They said her son had done well. They said he worked for important people now. They said he was no longer just a boy from a dusty village with no degree and no guarantee of tomorrow. He had risen. He had found his place among wealthy people. He was marrying into a powerful family. Some even spoke his name with pride. as if his success belonged in some small way to the village that had watched him leave. She listened quietly. At first she said little, but inside her, something gentle began to bloom. Not pride in the loud, boastful way other people carried it, not the kind that demanded to be seen. Hers was quieter than that, softer. It lived low in her chest, in the same place where she had once kept fear, hunger, and endurance. It felt like relief, like gratitude, like a long prayer finally being answered. For years she had imagined many versions of his future. She had imagined him working in an office. She had imagined him sending word home. She had imagined one day seeing him return in good clothes, standing straighter than when he left, carrying the look of a man whose suffering had not been wasted. But marriage was different. Marriage meant stability. It meant belonging. It meant he had entered a life that might finally hold him without breaking him. And so, as women around her smiled and spoke of celebration, she allowed herself to believe something simple, something deeply human, that surely, on a day like that, a son would want his mother near. She did not have much. Nothing in her life had changed with his success, not her home, not her routine, not the roughness of her hands, not the old wrapper she still wore to market. The village had remained what it had always been. The sun still rose the same way. The fields still demanded the same labor. Her body still carried the same burdens. But none of that mattered to her then. Because mothers, when they love deeply enough, often mistake hope for certainty. She began to prepare in the quiet, practical way she did everything else. She washed her best wrapper, though the color had long since faded from years of wear. She folded and refolded it with care, smoothing the fabric with her palms as if tenderness alone could make it new. She cleaned the headscarf she wore for church and special occasions. She chose the small cloth bag she used only when traveling, placing inside it the few things she could bring. A spare wrapper, a handkerchief, a little food for the road. And wrapped carefully in a corner of the cloth, a small gift, not expensive, not grand, but meaningful. A chain with a simple cross and a ring that had belonged to his father, the only thing of value she had kept through all the hard years. She had protected it through rain and hunger and seasons of need, not because of what it could buy, but because of what it meant. She wanted to place it in his hand herself, not as wealth, as blessing. The journey to the city was long enough for hope to rise and settle and rise again. The bus was crowded. The heat pressed in through the windows. The road stretched endlessly between places that felt familiar and places that did not. She sat quietly among strangers, her bag in her lap, one hand resting over it as if she were guarding not just her belongings, but her heart. At times she smiled to herself. At other times, she seemed almost worried by her own happiness, as though too much hope might invite disappointment. But each time doubt touched her, she pushed it away. This was her son. Whatever distance life had placed between them, whatever silence had grown where conversation once lived, blood remained blood. And a wedding, she believed, could heal many things. By the time she arrived in Lagos, the city was already glowing beneath late afternoon light. Everything about it felt louder than memory had prepared her for. The roads were fuller, the buildings taller, the air heavier with noise and movement. Cars passed too quickly. Voices overlapped. Music drifted from places she could not see. Wealth in the city did not hide. It announced itself in polished surfaces, uniformed guards, tinted windows, and the effortless confidence of people who had never doubted their right to be there. She held her bag close. Someone had told her the venue was grand. She had not understood what that meant until she saw it with her own eyes. The wedding was being held at a luxury hall attached to a 5-star hotel, a place designed not merely for celebration, but for display. Crystal chandeliers shone through towering glass. White flowers curved around the entrance in expensive arrangements. Luxury vehicles lined the front driveway. Men in tailored suits stepped out beside women dressed in fitted gowns that shimmered under soft gold lights. Their hair was perfect, their jewelry deliberate, their movements practiced. They belonged to a world that knew how to be admired, and there she stood at the edge of it. An elderly Nigerian woman in a faded traditional wrapper, her dark skin worn by the sun, her headscarf simple, her sandals plain, her hands marked by years of labor. She looked not merely modest, but out of place, so visibly distant from the elegance around her that the contrast itself became a kind of humiliation before a single word had even been spoken. Still, she smiled, because somewhere inside that room was her son. For a brief moment, that was enough. She stepped toward the entrance carefully, trying to move with dignity despite the weight of self-consciousness gathering inside her. She adjusted her wrapper once more, wiped her hands against the cloth, and lifted her chin the way women do when they are determined not to be made small. But before she could cross fully into the lobby, a guard stepped in front of her. He was polite at first, not kind but professional. "Madam, invitation?" She blinked. "I'm here for the wedding," she said softly. "Yes, madam, your invitation?" She did not have one. The question itself confused her for a moment, because she had not imagined needing proof to attend her own son's wedding. In the village, weddings belonged to community, to family, to whoever came with love in their heart and blessing in their mouth. "I'm his mother," she said, as if that should answer everything. The guard's face did not change. "Do you have a card, madam?" She shook her head slowly. People passing behind him had begun to notice. Not everyone, not yet, but enough. A glance here, a pause there. In places of wealth, curiosity arrives quickly when someone appears where they do not belong. "I came from the village," she explained, her voice still gentle, still trying to preserve dignity. "My son is the groom." The guard looked uncertain now, not convinced, but aware that this might become complicated. He spoke into his earpiece, his tone lower, and a second guard appeared. They looked at her, then at each other. The second one was less patient. "Madam, this is a private event." She tightened her grip on the bag. "Yes," she said. "That is why I am here." A few guests walking by did not bother to hide their reaction. One woman gave her a quick, dismissive look and then leaned toward the man beside her with the sort of smile that suggests someone else's discomfort has become entertainment. A younger woman in an elegant evening dress glanced over, then looked away with practiced indifference. A group of suited men slowed just long enough to assess the situation before continuing inside. The scene already filed away in their minds under the category of unpleasant things wealthy people prefer not to acknowledge. She stood there, feeling the heat of shame rise slowly through her body, not because she had done anything wrong, but because humiliation often begins before cruelty fully reveals itself. It begins the moment a person realizes they are being seen not as human, but as a problem. One of the guards asked for the groom's name. She gave it. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps. Or perhaps only the realization that if she was telling the truth, this could become awkward in ways no one at the entrance wanted to deal with. "Wait here," he said at last. So she waited. And while she waited, the world around her continued its elegant performance. Music drifted faintly from within. Laughter rose and fell. Luxury cars kept arriving. Women stepped past her in fitted gowns and perfume and confidence, their bare shoulders lit by the soft gold of evening. Men adjusted cuffs, checked watches, exchanged greetings with the easy familiarity of those used to important rooms. Everything gleamed. She became painfully aware of herself inside it, of the worn edge of her wrapper, of the way her sandals no longer held their shape, of the bag in her hand, of the dust that still seemed to cling to her somehow, despite the long journey and the care she had taken before leaving home. And yet, beneath all of that, hope still endured. Because she had not come for them. She had come for her son. Inside the hall, the wedding was unfolding exactly as the bride's family had imagined it should. Every detail had been considered. Every arrangement had been designed to reflect status, refinement, influence. White flowers framed the stage. Crystal glasses reflected the light. Important men moved through the room shaking hands. Elegant women laughed softly behind manicured fingers. It was less a family celebration than a public declaration of standing. And at the center of it all was the groom. In a premium white tuxedo, dark skin luminous beneath the warm lighting, posture controlled, face composed, he looked almost like the man he had always wanted to become. Guests praised him. Photographers followed him. Staff moved around him with careful attention. On the surface, he belonged perfectly. But belonging in such a room is never accidental. It is maintained, protected, curated. He had been doing that work for a long time. So when one of the event coordinators approached discreetly and whispered something into the bride's mother's ear, the woman turned immediately toward the entrance with visible irritation. "What now?" she asked. The answer came quietly. "An old woman is outside. She says she's the groom's mother." For the briefest second, the bride's mother simply stared. Then she laughed. A short, sharp sound. That's impossible. But what he didn't know would destroy everything he had. The chairman had seen enough. He had remained silent through the humiliation, not because he was indifferent, and not because he lacked the power to intervene sooner, but because there are moments when a man must be allowed to fully reveal himself before judgment carries any meaning. To stop cruelty too early is sometimes to leave its truth unexposed. And what had happened in that ballroom had gone beyond embarrassment, beyond class prejudice, beyond the usual ugliness of social performance. What the groom had done was not merely shameful. It was defining. So when the old woman was dragged beyond the glowing doors and the room was left suspended in stunned silence, the chairman finally stepped forward. He was a man whose presence did not need introduction. Even among wealth, there are those whose authority stands above display. He was one of them. Older now, his dark face marked not by weakness but by gravity, he carried himself with the stillness of someone who had long ago learned that the most powerful voice in any room is often the calmest one. The crowd made space without being told. The bride's father straightened instinctively. The bride's mother lowered her chin, suddenly less certain of the righteousness that had filled her moments before. And the groom, still standing where he had abandoned his own mother, turned toward him with a stiffness that betrayed the first crack of fear. The chairman did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What I have just witnessed," he said, "is one of the ugliest displays of cowardice I have seen in many years." No one moved. The words landed heavily because they were not theatrical. They carried none of the heat of impulsive anger. They carried judgment, cold, measured, unmistakable judgment. The groom opened his mouth as if to speak, but the chairman lifted one hand slightly, stopping him before a sound could form. "No," he said. "You have said enough." His eyes shifted, first to the groom, then to the bride's parents, then across the room itself, as though taking in not just the event, but every face that had watched in silence and allowed cruelty to stand until power named it wrong. "You invited this room to celebrate status," he said, "to admire success, to applaud a life polished enough to impress the city." He paused. "And yet the one person in this entire building who deserves the deepest respect was thrown out like a beggar." A low murmur moved through the guests. Not loud, not unruly. Just the sound of certainty beginning to fracture. The bride's father stepped forward carefully, already sensing danger, but still clinging to authority. "Chairman," he said, "there appears to have been some misunderstanding. We were told." "You were told what he wanted you to believe," the chairman cut in. That ended whatever confidence remained in the room. The groom felt it immediately, the shift. The terrifying sensation of power changing direction. For so long he had lived by appearances, managed them, protected them, built a future on them. And now, in front of the same people whose approval he had valued above truth, something larger than image was beginning to rise. The chairman turned fully toward him. "Do you know why your behavior today is not only disgraceful, but foolish?" The groom said nothing. Because suddenly, horribly, he was no longer certain of what he did or did not know. The chairman continued, "The woman you denied." He let the sentence hang for a second, giving the room time to lean into it. "Is not some desperate stranger from a forgotten village." Another pause. "Nor is she a burden attached to your past." Now the silence changed. It deepened, tightened. "She is the woman behind one of the largest agricultural investment groups in this country." This time the reaction could not be contained. Voices rose at once, shocked whispers, half-formed questions, the rustle of bodies turning toward one another in disbelief. Some guests frowned as though trying to place a name they had not expected to hear in this context. Others simply stared at the chairman, waiting to see if he would confirm what sounded impossible. The groom felt the blood leave his face. The bride's mother blinked rapidly, her lips parting without sound. The bride looked from the chairman to her groom and back again, the first signs of panic beginning to replace outrage. And the bride's father, who had spent his life learning how to maintain composure in every kind of room, stood suddenly very still, because he understood before most of them did. He understood what the name behind that power meant. He understood the scale, and most importantly, he understood what his own company stood to lose. The chairman let the shot breathe for another moment before continuing. "Many of you know her company," he said. "Some of you have shaken hands with its executives. Some of you have benefited from its distribution networks, its export support, its land development, its financing structures." Now he looked directly at the bride's father. "And your family," he said, "has survived the last 3 years because of contracts your business could never have sustained without her group's partnership." The sentence struck harder than anything else so far. The bride's father seemed to physically absorb it, as though hit in the chest by a force he had not prepared for. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked sharply at the groom, as if the younger black Nigerian man might somehow deny the catastrophe still forming around them. But the groom looked incapable of denying anything. He stood in the wreckage of his own choices, finally realizing the scale of the lie he had told, not just to others, but to himself. In his desperation to bury where he came from in Nigeria, he had not only betrayed the black Nigerian woman who raised him, he had failed to understand who she had become. The chairman's voice remained steady. She did not build that empire loudly. She did not parade herself before society. She did not waste her time trying to impress rooms like this one. His gaze swept over the chandeliers, the flowers, the polished floors, the expensive clothing, the carefully arranged symbols of importance inside the luxury Nigerian wedding hall. She built it the same way she survived. Hardship, quietly, intelligently, patiently, with discipline. No one in the hall seemed able to breathe normally anymore. The old assumptions, the easy hierarchy everyone had accepted the moment they saw an elderly black Nigerian woman in a worn wrapper at the door had collapsed too quickly for dignity to reorganize itself. And the chairman was not done. "You saw poverty in her clothing," he said. "You mistook simplicity for weakness. You saw age and humility and believed she had no power." He turned again to the groom. "And you." This time his voice hardened. "You were so ashamed of the dark hands that fed you that you never cared to learn what those hands had built." The groom lowered his eyes. "Not out of humility, out of exposure. Because shame changes shape once truth enters the room. Before, he had been ashamed of his past in a Nigerian village. Now he was ashamed of himself." The bride spoke then, but her voice no longer carried disgust. It carried confusion, fear, and the beginning of betrayal. "You knew?" she asked him. He looked at her, but there was nothing he could say. Because the honest answer was almost worse than a lie. He had not known. Not really. He had spent so many years trying to escape his origins that he had never once asked what his mother's silence contained. He had assumed it was only poverty, only waiting, only the kind of small life in rural Nigeria he wanted to leave behind. But while he was busy reinventing himself in Lagos, Nigeria, she had been building something larger than any of them had imagined. The chairman let the room sit with that humiliation. It mattered that they feel it. Not because cruelty should be repaid with cruelty, but because some lessons only enter the heart after pride has been broken open. Then, quietly he said, "Bring her back." No one moved at first. The guards, embarrassed now, looked toward the entrance as though uncertain whether they still had the right to touch the story they had helped mishandle. The chairman repeated it. "Bring her back." With respect. That word respect hung over the room like accusation. A moment later, the doors opened again, and she re-entered. The elderly black Nigerian woman walked slowly, not because she wanted to create drama, but because pain has a way of taking the strength out of a person's body. Her wrapper still bore the stain of the drink. Her face had been wiped, but not enough to erase what had happened. Her bag remained clutched in one hand. Her eyes were red, but dry now, as though tears had already been replaced by something steadier. The room watched her differently this time. That was the first reversal, no longer with dismissal, no longer with irritated curiosity. Now there was discomfort, shame, calculation, recognition arriving too late. The bride's mother looked at the floor. A few guests who had once leaned away from the elderly Nigerian woman now seemed uncertain where to place their own hands. The bride herself stood motionless, staring at the woman she had allowed herself to see only as an intrusion. It is a terrible thing to realize that your cruelty was directed not merely at the vulnerable, but at the dignified. The chairman stepped toward the old woman, not close enough to overwhelm her, but enough to create visible alignment. "Ma'am," he said gently, with a deference no one in the room could ignore, "I am sorry for what has happened here." That shook them all more than any revelation. Power was apologizing to humility. And in doing so, it was teaching the entire room exactly how wrong they had been. She said nothing for a moment. Not because she was weak, but because the distance between humiliation and vindication is often too great to cross immediately. Her pain had not vanished simply because the room now understood her worth. Public shame does not disappear the moment respect arrives. It lingers. Still, when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "I did not come here for status," she said. "I came for my son." That sentence broke whatever remained of the groom's composure. Because there it was again, the unbearable simplicity of a mother's love, standing in direct contrast to the ugliness of what he had done with it. The chairman looked at her, then nodded once. "And yet," he said quietly, "status has followed you here." There was no arrogance in the line, only truth. He turned slightly, enough for the room to understand that what happened next would not be theatrical. It would be administrative, decisive, final. The old woman reached into the cloth bag she had carried from her Nigerian village. For one surreal second, some of the guests perhaps expected a simple object, some small keepsake that might further sentimentalize the moment. Instead, she removed a phone. Not flashy, not performative, just precise. The kind of detail that announces power far more effectively than diamonds ever could. She dialed a number from memory. No shaking hands. No hesitation. When the call connected, her voice changed, not in warmth, not in volume, but in authority. "This is Madame Adeyemi," she said. The room seemed to flinch at the name. The bride's father certainly did. He knew it. Of course he knew it. Everyone serious in Nigerian agribusiness knew it. Her company's public structure had always been layered. Her visibility had always been selective. But the name spoken now in that calm, controlled tone made the entire thing irreversible. "I want all partnerships with Adebayo Holding suspended immediately," she said. The bride's father stepped forward at once. "Please," she did not even look at him. "All pending contracts. All credit extensions. All logistical access. Freeze them." The person on the other end must have asked a question. "Yes," she said. "Effective now." Still the bride's father moved closer, panic breaking through his polished image at last. "Madam, there must be some misunderstanding. We can discuss this privately." Now she looked at him. And what he saw in her face was not rage. That would have been easier. What he saw was clarity. The kind that comes when pain has burned away the need to explain. "You discussed me publicly," she said. "You judged me publicly. You humiliated me publicly." Each sentence landed harder than the last. "Now you can face the consequences publicly." No one spoke. No one interrupted. Because power had completed its turn. The bride's father tried again, his voice lower now, urgent and stripped of dignity. "Our company employs hundreds of people. You cannot make a decision like this over a single moment." "A single moment?" the chairman repeated sharply, stepping in before the old woman needed to answer. "A single moment reveals character. And character determines whether any serious person should trust you." The bride's father fell silent. Because underneath all the public embarrassment, he understood the business truth better than anyone else in the room. Without her support, their company would not merely struggle. It would stagger, then bleed, then collapse. The bride's mother had lost all color in her face. She looked between her husband, the old woman, and the guests surrounding them, already sensing the social ruin unfolding in real time. The bride herself seemed unable to process what had happened. The groom stood in stunned stillness, no longer at the center of the Nigerian wedding. No longer the rising black man everyone had admired, just a son who had denied the wrong woman in the wrong room at the worst possible time. The old woman ended the call. No flourish, no speech, just a quiet final motion. And somehow that made it more devastating. Because real power seldom performs, it decides. A phone buzzed somewhere near the bride's father. Then another, then his own. He looked down, hands suddenly unsteady. A message, then another. A call from one of his executives. He answered at once, stepping aside, but not far enough to escape the room's attention. "What do you mean suspended?" he hissed. The voice on the other end was loud enough that those nearest could hear fragments. "Shipment holds, bank review, supplier panic, media risk. Call the legal team." His face changed as he listened. This was no bluff. The machinery had already begun to move. The bride's mother touched his arm. "What is it?" But he pulled away, not out of cruelty, but because fear had finally overwhelmed image. The chairman said nothing more. He didn't need to. The old woman didn't move. She simply stood there, no taller than before, no louder, no more adorned. Her wrapper was still old. Her headscarf still simple. But now the room understood what should have been understood from the beginning. Dignity is not created by wealth. It is revealed by character. And power, when real, does not need to look rich. It only needs to be real. Around the ballroom, whispers rose openly now. Guests leaned toward one another, voices urgent and disbelieving. "That's her? I had no idea. Adebayo depends on her logistics. They're finished." The bride's father ended the call and looked up with the face of a man watching his future crack in public. The bride's mother no longer looked superior. She looked terrified. And for the first time that evening, the family who had measured everyone else by status understood what it felt like to stand beneath someone greater and realize too late that they had mistaken humility for helplessness. Panic moved through them quickly now, not the dramatic kind, the more humiliating kind. The kind that shows in shallow breath, darting eyes, whispered questions, hands reaching for phones, minds racing ahead to losses not yet fully visible, but already unavoidable. The bride's father called for another executive. The bride's mother asked what could be done. The bride looked as though the ground beneath her had shifted. And the room watched the family that had once stood tallest begin, all at once, to unravel. The bride's family was in panic. In one moment, everything collapsed. The wedding did not end with music. It ended with silence. Not the gentle silence that sometimes follows emotion when people are too moved to speak. This was a different kind of silence, heavy, exposing. The kind that falls when illusion collapses in front of witnesses and no one can pretend not to have seen it happen. The flowers were still in place in the grand Nigerian wedding hall. The lights still glowed softly against polished glass and gold fabric. The tables were still dressed for celebration. But none of it meant what it had meant an hour earlier. The luxury remained, yet the room had changed. What was supposed to feel grand now felt hollow, as if the elegance itself had become a stage no one wanted to stand on anymore. At the center of that emptiness stood the groom. Not triumphant, not respected, not admired, just exposed. He had built so much of his life around appearing worthy in rooms like this one. Around being accepted by people who measured a man not only by what he had achieved, but by how smoothly he could fit into their idea of success. And now, in the very room where he had hoped to secure that future forever, he stood stripped of every illusion that had carried him there. The bride was the first to move. She had not said much during the chairman's revelation. Shock had held her in place, the way it often does when truth arrives too quickly for anger to fully form. But now, as the whispers around the room grew bolder and the reality of her family's sudden vulnerability became impossible to deny, something in her expression hardened. She turned toward him slowly. He looked at her, and for a moment, just one desperate moment, he seemed to hope she might still separate him from what had happened. That she might see this as confusion, as fear, as one terrible mistake, instead of the unveiling of character it truly was. But what she saw when she looked at the black Nigerian groom was no longer the man she had imagined marrying. She saw the son who had thrown a drink into his mother's face. She saw the man who had lied without hesitation. She saw someone who, under pressure, had chosen cruelty over truth. And once seen clearly, that kind of thing cannot be unseen. Her hands moved to the ring first, not dramatically, not for effect, just with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that some endings do not need speeches. She slid it from her finger and held it for a second in her palm, staring at it as if it belonged to another woman's life now. Then she placed it into his hand. The small weight of it felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. "This wedding is over," she said. Her voice did not tremble. That made it worse. He stared at her. There are words a man imagines he will say in a moment of collapse. Pleas, explanations, regret shaped into language quickly enough to matter. But when the actual moment came, his mouth opened and nothing useful emerged. "It's not," he began. She stopped him with a look. "Don't." One word. Final. Around them, people looked away, not out of mercy, but because public endings make everyone uncomfortable when they are too honest. The bride's mother, who earlier had spoken with such confidence, now stood off to the side with a face drained of all superiority. Her father was still buried in urgent calls and whispered instructions, his polished authority falling apart beneath the pressure of a company suddenly at risk. No one rushed to defend the groom. No one moved to stand beside him. Because in rooms governed by status, loyalty rarely survives scandal. The bride took a step back from him, then another. And in that physical distance, something far more painful than anger took shape. Withdrawal. A future closing itself. "You lied to me," she said quietly. "Not just about your mother. About yourself." He tried again. "I was afraid." This time she let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. "And when you were afraid," she said, "you humiliated the one person who loved you before you had anything. There was no answer to that. None. Because the statement did not accuse, it described." Her gaze dropped briefly to his hand, to the ring resting there like evidence. Then she lifted her eyes once more, and whatever tenderness had ever existed between them was gone. "I could survive marrying a poor man," she said. "I could never survive marrying a cruel one." Then she turned away, not quickly, not dramatically, just completely. And in that completeness, he understood something he had not allowed himself to understand all night. He was no longer losing appearances. He was losing people. Staff began moving through the room in strange, careful patterns, unsure whether to continue clearing tables or pretend the celebration had only been postponed. Guests murmured to one another in clusters, already reshaping the evening into story, into rumor, into lesson. Some slipped toward the exit. Others remained, held by the kind of fascination that always follows collapse. A ruined celebration, like a public disgrace, has its own gravity. He stood still for too long. still holding the ring, still wearing the white tuxedo that had, only a short time ago, seemed to signal arrival. Now it felt almost ridiculous on him. Too bright, too clean, too untouched by the ugliness of what he had done. A member of the bride's family approached him, not one of the powerful ones, not someone important enough to soften the moment. Just a relative, embarrassed and brisk, speaking with the cold efficiency of someone tasked with removing what no longer belongs. "You need to leave," the man said. He looked up slowly, as if the sentence itself were difficult to process. "This is still my wedding." The man did not bother to hide the contempt in his face. "No," he said. "It isn't." A few people nearby heard that. No one corrected it. No one offered him grace. The relative gestured toward the entrance. "Take your things and go." There it was. The final humiliation. Not only abandoned at the altar, not only stripped of the future he thought he had secured, but dismissed from the very room where he had betrayed his mother to remain welcome. He wanted, for one foolish second, to resist, to argue, to reclaim some fragment of control. But ruin has a way of making resistance look pathetic. So he looked down at the ring in his palm, curled his fingers around it, and said nothing. He walked, past the white flowers, past the chandeliers, past the faces that would never again look at him with admiration. The same guests whose approval had once felt worth protecting now became witnesses to his disgrace. Some did not look at him at all. Others did, and in their expressions he saw the full spectrum of social judgment: disappointment, disgust, pity, satisfaction. Not one of those looks felt as painful as the absence of the one face he had already lost outside those doors. By the time he stepped into the night air, the sounds of the ballroom had dimmed behind him, replaced by the muted noise of traffic beyond the gates and the restless movement of a city that did not stop simply because one man's life had cracked open. For a few seconds he just stood there. No cameras, no applause, no family, no bride, no role left to play. The parking area glowed under neat rows of lights. Luxury cars still lined the driveway, though some were beginning to pull away. Staff moved around him as if he were already invisible. Somewhere behind the hotel, generators hummed steadily, indifferent to human shame. And for the first time in years, he had nowhere to go that felt like his own. He checked his phone instinctively. Messages flooded the screen. Not from friends offering comfort. From colleagues asking what had happened. From numbers he recognized but did not want to answer. From work contacts suddenly quiet in the ways that matter most. Even before the consequences fully arrived, he could feel them taking shape. Opportunity has a scent when it is close. So does collapse. His room at the staff quarters no longer felt possible. His ties to the family business were already evaporating. The company that had once trusted him would hear the story before morning. And the city, which had never promised loyalty to begin with, was already turning away. He walked farther from the entrance and sat at the edge of a low stone divider near the parking lot, still in his wedding clothes, still gripping the ring like a fool who didn't know when to open his hand and let loss look like loss. Hours seemed to pass inside minutes. The city wind carried the scent of exhaust and distant rain. A few guests leaving the venue glanced at him and then away, recognizing him not as a groom anymore, but as the center of a disaster they would retell later in safer, cleaner homes. His mind replayed the scene in fragments. Not the chairman's words, not the bride's rejection. Those were painful, yes, but they came after. What returned again and again was his mother's face, the moment she saw him at the entrance, the light in her eyes before he spoke, the confusion when he asked what she was doing there, the hurt when he told her to leave, the silence after he said she was no one. And then that final look after the drink struck her wet, stunned, wounded not just by what he had done, but by what it revealed. He pressed his hands together and lowered his head. Until then, shame had always been tied to his past, to poverty, to the village, to the fear of being seen as small. But now shame had changed shape. Now it was tied to his own actions, to his voice, his hand, his choices. This was worse, because there was no one else left to blame. He had spent years telling himself a quiet story, that survival required reinvention, that ambition demanded distance, that truth could be edited if success depended on it. He had called it necessity. He had called it growth. He had called it moving forward. But sitting there alone, stripped of every performance, he began to see those justifications for what they really were. Excuses. The city had not made him cruel. Wealth had not forced him to lie. Pressure had not reached into his chest and emptied it of love. Those things had revealed what he was willing to do when he feared losing status. And that realization settled over him with a force greater than any punishment the night could still deliver. He had not merely lost the wedding. He had not merely lost the bride. He had not merely endangered his future. He had abandoned the one person who had never abandoned him. The one person whose sacrifice had carried him into every room he had later used to erase her. A man can survive poverty. He can survive disappointment. He can even survive public humiliation, if time and effort give him a road back. But some losses are deeper than circumstance. They begin in the soul. And as he sat there in the silence after everything had ended, the city stretching around him vast and indifferent, he felt that deeper loss for the first time. Not as punishment, as truth. And with that truth came something else, not yet redemption, not yet courage, not even fully formed remorse. Just the first unbearable clarity of a man finally seeing himself without excuses. At last, alone in the wreckage of the life he had tried so hard to secure, he recognized the thing he should have understood long before wealth, before pressure, before fear ever entered the room. He had been wrong. And in the emptiness that followed the collapse of everything he thought he wanted, he began truly to understand the size of his mistake. He realized his mistake, so he went back to the place he once left behind. The old house should have been there. In his mind, it had never changed. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how far the city had carried him from the red soil of his childhood, some part of him had preserved that place exactly as it had been the day he left it. A low, weathered structure of wood and sheet metal. A roof that rattled under heavy rain. A doorway worn smooth by years of use. Walls that held more endurance than comfort. A yard of packed earth. A few stubborn plants. And the silent evidence of a life built not on ease, but on persistence. That was the image he carried with him as he traveled back. Not because memory is always accurate, but because guilt prefers simple pictures. It likes to imagine that what we abandon remained exactly where we left it, waiting quietly for our return. The road into the village felt narrower than he remembered. Or perhaps he was larger, now larger in failure, larger in regret, carrying more weight inside him than the road had ever been meant to bear. The city had fallen away behind him mile by mile, replaced again by open sky, scattered homes, the smell of dry grass and warm earth. Familiar sounds returned in fragments, distant voices, the rustle of leaves, the low rhythm of village life moving without hurry. Every mile pressed harder against his chest. He had told himself many things on the journey back. That he would apologize, that he would kneel if he had to, that he would not defend himself, that whatever anger waited for him, he would accept it. But beneath all those promises was one assumption he had never thought to question, that he was returning to the same poverty he had once fled, that he would find the same fragile home, the same quiet struggle, the same life paused in place while he had spent years outrunning it. And because he believed that, he expected the first sting of recognition to arrive gently. He expected the bend in the road, the old fence, the faded walls, the tree under which he had once sat as a boy, watching his mother return from the fields. Instead, what he saw stopped him where he stood. The house was gone, not damaged, not repaired, gone. In its place rose something so wholly at odds with memory that for one disorienting second, he thought he had taken the wrong road. A wide gated property stood where the old home should have been, set back from the road behind elegant stone walls and dark wrought iron gates. The driveway curved inward with deliberate grace. Palm trees lined the entrance. The landscaping was precise, cared for, expensive in a way that did not need to announce itself loudly. The building beyond was not merely large. It was a mansion. Its design carried a quiet confidence, high windows, broad balconies, pale stone catching the light, clean architectural lines that suggested both wealth and restraint. It did not look like the kind of place built by someone desperate to impress strangers. It looked like the kind of place built by someone who had already surpassed the need for approval. He stared at it in complete stillness. The old dust of the road clung to his shoes. His clothes still carried the creases of travel. His body, exhausted by shame and sleeplessness, was no longer prepared for surprise of this scale. For a few moments, he could not make sense of what he was seeing, because the mind does not easily surrender the past it has used to define itself. He looked around the road again. The neighboring houses were familiar. The bend in the path was right. The tree was still there, though older now, fuller. Even the small roadside, while not far from the property, remained exactly where it had always been. This was the place. And yet, it was not. He took a step forward, then another, drawn by confusion more than intention. At the gate stood a polished sign set into dark stone. The metal lettering gleamed against the afternoon light. Adeyemi Agricultural Group. For a second, his eyes simply moved over the words without understanding them. Then they returned. Slower this time, Adeyemi, his mother's name. The air seemed to thin around him. He walked closer, as though nearness might somehow make the impossible easier to comprehend. Beyond the gate, he could see vehicles parked with careful spacing, uniformed staff moving in calm, efficient patterns, and farther in the distance, a second building that looked less residential and more administrative, glass-fronted, modern, designed for operations, not sentiment. There were workers here, security, order, scale. Nothing about this was accidental. His thoughts, already frayed by everything that had happened in the city, began to shift violently. Images collided in his head. The old wrapper, the worn sandals, the bag clutched tightly in weathered hands against this estate, this company name, this visible evidence of power and permanence. He had spent years believing that his mother had remained trapped inside the life he had escaped. Now every detail before him accused that belief. A black vehicle moved slowly through the inner drive and parked beneath a covered entrance. Two staff members crossed the courtyard, carrying folders and speaking in low, focused tones. Somewhere farther back, he could hear machinery, not harsh or chaotic, but purposeful, the sound of business moving with structure and reach. This was not hidden wealth. It was organized wealth, institutional wealth, the kind that employs people, directs land, influences markets. And it was here, in the very place he had left behind, thinking nothing of significance could ever rise from it. A guard near the entrance noticed him and approached with professional caution. "Can I help you, sir?" The question should have been simple. Instead, it exposed how little language he had left. He looked from the guard to the sign, then back again. "This," he began, but his voice failed. He tried once more. "This used to be a small house." The guard's face softened slightly, perhaps reading something unstable in him that did not fit threat. "That was many years ago," he said. "Many years ago." The phrase landed with quiet cruelty. Yes, many years ago. Years in which he had built lies in the city while something vast had been built here. Years in which he had mistaken silence for helplessness. Years in which he had never once asked what his mother was becoming, because he had already decided what she represented. He took another slow step toward the gate. "And this company?" he asked, though he already knew the answer before it came. The guard glanced briefly toward the sign, then back at him. "It belongs to Madame Adeyemi, not the company, not the group, not some distant board or unseen executive. Madame Adeyemi, his mother." The title itself struck him almost harder than the mansion, because titles reorder memory. They force the mind to revisit every old image with new meaning. The woman in the field, the woman at the roadside market, the woman who gave him her food and sent him to the city with faith. She had every reason not to trust. All this time, while he had been busy trying to erase her from his story, she had been writing one far greater than anything he had imagined for himself. He looked again through the gate, and now the estate seemed to unfold differently before him. Not just as a symbol of wealth, but as proof of a life he had never cared enough to understand. What he once called rural struggle had become strategy. What he dismissed as simplicity had become discipline. What he assumed was waiting had, in fact, been work, quiet, intelligent, relentless work unfolding beyond the limits of his own shallow imagination. His chest tightened painfully. Because revelation is never only about what is newly seen. It is also about what must now be admitted. He had not simply denied a poor mother in a rich room. He had denied a woman of dignity, power, and vision, because he had trained himself to see only the surface of her sacrifice. He had called himself ambitious, yet she had built an empire. He had called himself changed, yet she had grown beyond every category he had once used to diminish where he came from. In the wide reflective windows of the mansion, he caught a faint image of himself small beyond the gate, road dust still on him, face drawn and hollowed by shame. For the first time, the contrast was complete. Not village versus city, not poverty versus wealth, but truth versus illusion. And standing there before the estate that had risen where his old house once stood, beneath the name he should have honored long before he understood its power, he finally felt the full force of it. He was stunned. He was shocked. He dropped to his knees before her, not slowly, not with dignity, but with the kind of collapse that comes when a man finally runs out of places to hide. The polished stone beneath him felt cold, unfamiliar, so different from the rough earth he had once stood on as a boy. His hands trembled as they pressed against the ground, not from weakness, but from the weight of everything he had carried back with him. The mansion stood quiet behind her. Staff had stepped away. The air held still. And in that stillness there were no witnesses left to impress, no audience left to convince, only truth. "I didn't know," he said. The words came out broken, smaller than he had imagined they would be. Not an explanation. Not a defense. Just a fragment, something that sounded more like a plea than a sentence. He lifted his head slightly, just enough to see her. She stood before him the way she always had, not taller, not louder, not transformed by the wealth he had only just discovered. Her wrapper was still simple, though cleaner now. Her headscarf tied with the same quiet care. Her face carried the lines of age and experience, but also something deeper, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with endurance. For a long moment, she said nothing. And that silence pressed harder on him than any anger could have. Because anger can be answered, silence cannot. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice shaking more openly now. "I didn't know what you had built. I didn't know who you had become." He swallowed, struggling to keep his words from breaking apart completely. "I thought," he stopped, because what he had thought now sounded too small, too foolish to survive being spoken aloud. He lowered his eyes again. "I was wrong." That was the closest he could come to the truth, not because he lacked words, but because the truth was too large to fit inside them. He had been wrong about her, wrong about himself, wrong about what mattered, wrong about what success meant, wrong about what he was willing to destroy to protect something that had never truly belonged to him. The silence stretched. He waited for anger, for rejection, for anything that would give shape to what came next. Instead, when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. "You didn't know?" she said. The question was not loud, but it cut deeper than anything he had heard that day. He looked up again, desperate now, not for forgiveness, but for something that would lessen the weight pressing down on him. "I didn't," he said. "If I had known." She stopped him with a slight movement of her hand, not forceful, not dramatic. "Just enough. You knew enough, she said. Her eyes met his fully now. No tears, no softness, just clarity. You knew enough to be ashamed of me. The words landed with finality, not raised, not sharpened, simply placed. And in that placement, they carried the full truth he'd been trying to outrun. Because she was right. He had not needed to know about wealth. He had not needed to know about companies or contracts or power. He had known who she was. He had known what she had done for him. He had known the hands that fed him, the sacrifices that shaped him, the life that carried him into the very room where he chose to deny her. And still he had been ashamed. That was the truth. Not ignorance. Choice. He felt something inside him give way. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. I'm sorry, he said. The words came now without resistance, stripped of any attempt to explain, to justify, to soften what could not be softened. I'm sorry, he said again, lower this time. I failed you. For a moment, just a moment, there was something in her expression that shifted. Not forgiveness, but recognition. Because even after everything, she still knew the boy who had once walked beside her in silence, who had once carried her basket even when it was too heavy, who had once understood her without needing words. That boy was still there, buried, but not gone. And perhaps that was what made this harder. Because love, when it remains, does not always rush to heal. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it demands that the wound be fully understood before it begins to close. She looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped back, not far, just enough to create distance. Distance that could not be closed with words. Distance that would have to be crossed, if it ever could be, through something far greater than apology. You have learned something today, she said quietly. He nodded, though the motion felt small compared to the truth it carried. Yes, but learning is not the same as changing. That too was true. And he knew it. Because change takes time. And time does not erase what has already been done. She turned slightly, her gaze moving away from him, toward the grounds behind her, toward the life she had built without needing recognition from anyone, least of all the son who had once been her reason for everything. I cannot pretend this did not happen, she said. He lowered his head. I know. I cannot forget it, she continued. His hands tightened against the ground. I know. A pause. Then, and I cannot forgive it. Today, the final words settled into the air like something that would not move. Not harsh, not cruel, just honest. He closed his eyes. Not because he didn't expect it, but because hearing it made the loss real in a way nothing else had. Forgiveness, he realized then, was not something he could ask for and receive. It was something he would have to earn. If it could ever be earned at all. She looked at him one last time, not with rejection, not with anger, but with the quiet, unyielding strength that had defined her long before wealth ever touched her life. Then, without another word, she turned. And she walked away. Success can change a man's life, but it reveals who he truly is.